In this lecture, we're going to talk about how the New Testament fits with the Old Testament. And so to do that, we are going to use a timeline to help us think a little bit in terms of the whole Bible, the whole meta narrative that runs across Scripture from Old Testament into New Testament. And so what starts with, well, you have Genesis 1 through 11, and you have the story of good creation that has become corrupt because of the sinfulness of humanity. I'm sure many of you know, have heard the story of Adam and Eve. You can find it in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2, we have the creation of the man and the woman, Adam and Eve. And then in chapter 3, we have the temptation and the fall. And the serpent is able to convince the man and the woman that God is not good, that God is against them, that God is trying to oppress them and hold them down. And they rebel against God and disobey, and that brings sin, that brings death into the world, and that impacts all of creation. That humanity was created in the image of God. We were to reflect the goodness of God, the righteousness of God, the holiness of God, the love of God to each other and out into creation. And when humanity messes up, when humanity sins and rebels against God and doesn't see God as trustworthy, then that doesn't just affect humanity, that affects all of creation. And so we have a very fallen and broken world. What is God going to do about it? So that's kind of the plot. You know, the world has become broken, it's full of sin, humanity has rebelled against God, no longer truly reflecting God's character to each other and out into the world. And so what is God going to do about it? Well, God calls Abraham. And our timeline, we're about 1800 BC, and God calls Abraham, and God makes a promise to Abraham that God is going to give him land, give him children, and that God is going to be with him. And most of all, God is going to bless all peoples through Abraham and his line, his descendants. So Abraham is the solution, if you will, to sinful, rebellious humanity and creation that has become so broken. And the promise again is children, land, the presence of God. God is with Abraham, but the bottom line purpose for it is blessing. And again, blessing all. So God isn't going to just bless Abraham and his children. God is going to use Abraham to bless all peoples. So again, just trying to emphasize it. You have the promise of land and children, the presence of God with Abraham. That's the only way he's going to get land and children. But most importantly, the purpose of the promise, that through Abraham and his family, God is going to bless all the families of the earth. God is going to redeem a fallen world, a sinful humanity. Okay, so that's the first promise. And then we come to Moses. And so Abraham and Sarah, they have Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. God works through Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. And they end up down in Egypt. And Joseph is raised up as son number 11 and ends up saving the family, but they're down in Egypt when Genesis ends. When we get into Exodus, we discover that they're being oppressed now, that they're being worked ruthlessly, that they're in slavery down in Egypt. And so the question is God with them? Is God going to rescue this family and use this family to bless all the families of the earth? Well, God raises up Moses. And Moses is the one who leads them up out of Egypt. I'm sure many of you have seen The Prince of Egypt, pretty good account of it. And so Moses is used of God to lead them out of Egypt, but it's just not about setting them free from the Pharaoh. It's about them becoming God's covenant people. And so we especially read about this in Exodus 19, where they become the covenant people of God. They are in a relationship with God that we might even think of as a marriage, this commitment of loyalty to each other. And there's a promise here in Exodus 19 that if you will listen to me, if you will obey my voice, follow through on my commands that are in this covenant, then you'll be for me most treasured of all the peoples on the earth, and you will be a kingdom of priests, and you will be a holy nation. And so it's through this people living in covenant with God that God is going to bless all humanity, that God is going to reveal God's self to all humanity and bring restoration. Now, this people is to be set apart to God and so conform to God that God becomes knowable to the rest of creation, the rest of the peoples through this people because of their close relationship with God. And in this close relationship with God, they're going to live a particular way. They are going to conduct themselves in relationship to God, in relationship to each other, in relationship to creation. They conduct themselves in a way that fits God's character. And so by knowing this people that conforms to God's character, all nations will know who this God is and realize that it's this God who is creator. It's this God who is worthy of our worship and who gives life. So Exodus 19, huge passage in the Old Testament, one of the most important passages in the Old Testament. This covenant people is created. They've been liberated from Pharaoh. They come to Mount Sinai. The Lord has brought them there and enters into covenant with them. Now, you know the story. While this is God's purpose for them, they don't fulfill it so well. They end up spending 40 years in the wilderness because they didn't trust God to lead them into that land that was promised to Moses. There's all kinds of sin and rebellion that takes place during that time, but God does not give up on them. God continues to find a way to stay faithful to the covenant and brings them into the promised land through Joshua. And so in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament, this is where they first enter into the promised land. And it is a major landmark entering into the promised land. So Joshua takes them in. And their challenge is that in the land, they need to be obedient and they need to live out these covenant stipulations as the people of God. They don't do this so well, pretty rocky. Eventually, they're going to get a king. And the king is supposed to lead the people in keeping Torah, keeping covenant. The king is to exercise God's rule over the people. Most important king in the Old Testament is David. He is the second king of Israel. Saul was the first one. He didn't do so well. God had David anointed as king, as their second king. And most important about David is a promise that we find in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And this promise is of a dynasty, that I will be as a father to your son will be a son to me, and I will not keep my love from him or from your line, an everlasting kingdom, this dynasty. And it was the line of David's job to exercise God's rule over the people. So one way to think about it is that we think of God as up in heaven and God rules up in heaven. How does God's rule in heaven actually get done down on the earth and over God's people, over all peoples? Well, the answer is through the line of David. That David's son, David's line, they're the ones who are to execute the rule of God over the people so that God's rule is getting done. Okay, so that's what's going on with this kind of father-son language. It's the son's job to carry out the will of the father on earth. And so major promise. You will always have a son on the throne, this promise of a dynasty, and God will basically rule from heaven through this son. Of course, that son doesn't do so well across the years, but that's the promise. Next son is Solomon. And Solomon is the one who comes to the throne after David. And Solomon is the one who you can read about it in 1 Kings 8 and 9. This is where we have the temple built. Okay, and so Solomon builds a temple in Jerusalem, and he prays this beautiful prayer. God, we know that you cannot be contained in this temple, but when we pray here, when we gather here and seek you, will you hear from heaven and respond and answer our prayers? And in 1 Kings 9, God tells Solomon, yes, I'll do that. My name will be there. I'll watch over that place. Okay, so I want to step back just a moment, and I want you to think about what we have so far. We have 4 promises really on the board. Okay, promise 1 is, we'll go here with land. That God promised Abraham and his descendants the promised land. And if it's helpful, we can think of it in terms of terrain or turf. We'll get a T in there. Okay, the next promise we have, Exodus 19, this creation of a covenant people that is going to live by Torah. Okay, God's instructions for them in terms of how they are to conduct themselves with God, with each other, with creation. Okay, and if they do that, then they will be this very special people for God, special in the sense of God is going to use them to reach out to all peoples as a priestly kingdom, and they'll conform to God. They'll be a holy nation, so that through this people, God will bless all peoples. Okay, but the key is that they got to listen. They got to keep Torah. Third promise with David, and that is of a throne, an everlasting dynasty. That God is making this promise to David that you won't fail to have a son on the throne, and your son will be as a son to me, I will be as a father to him. So this father-son relationship where it's the king's responsibility, the son's responsibility to carry out the rule, the justice, the righteousness of God over God's people, and to lead the people in keeping Torah. Promise number 4, Solomon and the temple. That my name will be there. You'll meet me there. I'll meet you there. I'll watch over that place. I'll hear from heaven. I'll respond to your prayers. I will be present over you there. And so huge promises. Okay, and so hold on. You got to know these promises. The promise of land, the promise of terrain. We'll keep our T's going. Promise of Torah, promise of the throne, promise of temple. Now, what happens next? Well, after Solomon, the kingdom is split. So Solomon had a lot of wives, and he built, many of them were foreign wives, and so they brought the gods of their peoples in. And so not only did Solomon build a temple for the Lord, Solomon built worship sites for the gods and goddesses of his wives. And so this was a horrible thing. He institutionalized the worship of other gods within Israel. So God says, because you've done this, I'm going to take the kingdom from you, and I'm going to leave one tribe basically out of loyalty to David, and the kingdom is going to be split. And Solomon's son comes to the throne, and he decides he's going to be even harsher than his father was, heavier taxes, heavier conscripted labor, and the people rebel. So about 930, the kingdom of Israel splits, and you have two kingdoms. You have the northern kingdom of Israel, and sometimes it's referred to as Ephraim because that was the largest tribe. And they rebelled against Solomon and against Solomon's son, and so they're the larger kingdom. The smaller kingdom is to the south. That's the kingdom of Judah, basically one tribe. And this is where Jerusalem is at. This is where the temple is at. This is where the line of David is at. So kind of just following through the line of David, Solomon, and then it's going to stay in the southern kingdom. That's where Jerusalem is at. So you'll continue to have a son of David on the throne all across here. Northern kingdom, their kings come from different places. You can read more about it in 1st and 2nd Kings if you want to. But the northern kingdom, they're going to be destroyed in 722 by Assyria. And from the perspective of 1st and 2nd Kings, the reason why they're destroyed by Assyria is because of their sinfulness. That they worship Baal and Ashtoreth. They're not faithful to the covenant. And so because they haven't been faithful to the covenant, God is going to inflict the covenant curses upon them, and they're going to be destroyed by Assyria. And when Assyria takes over, they repopulate the area. And so they take Israelites and move them to different places in their empire. And some of the Israelites actually went south to Jerusalem and Judah. And then the Assyrians are going to bring other peoples in that they've conquered and place them in the land of Israel, in that territory. And so you're going to end up with kind of a mixed people and very mixed religion. And so this is where we get the term the Samaritans over against the Jews. This area was known as Samaria. And so this people was called the Samaritans. And so they they claim to worship Israel's God, but there's a syncretism involved there and kind of a racial mix, if you will. So they're not, quote unquote, purely Jewish. They don't worship just the Lord. And so you get the Samaritans. Okay, and many of you already know enough New Testament stories to know about the Samaritan woman at the well, or the parable of the Good Samaritan, how there was this animosity and rivalry between the Jews and the Samaritans. Well, it goes back to this time when the Assyrians brought other people in, and then you have this kind of mixture of races, mixture of religions. So it's not simply a racial thing, it's a religious thing. And they were looked down upon by the Jews in Jerusalem. And that continued for generations, centuries. Okay, so what's going on with the southern kingdom? So the southern kingdom is going to continue. This is where you have the line of David ruling, and it's going to survive until 587 BC. And the Babylonians now are the dominant empire. They conquered Assyria around 612. And so the dominant empire is Babylon. And Babylon comes and takes over Jerusalem, the whole area of Judea. And it was a form of judgment. When we read through 2 Kings, when we read through Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and some of the minor prophets, what we discover is that God has raised up the Babylonians to bring judgment upon Judah and Jerusalem because of their sins. Much as God used Assyria to bring the curses upon the northern kingdom, so now God is using Babylon to execute covenant curses upon the southern kingdom, Judah, and the city of Jerusalem. The kings were corrupt, and they did not rely upon the Lord, and we have idolatry as well as injustice taking place. And so finally God says, okay, that's it. It is time to execute the curses of the covenant. And so Babylon comes, and the people are carried into captivity, into exile. So they are removed from the promised land. And so when we think about what's going on here in exile in Babylon, people taken captive, what have they lost? Okay, well, they've lost the promised land. Okay, so now the promised land is controlled by Babylon, and they have been removed from the promised land. The Babylonians only left the poorest of the poor there. Some people were able to escape down to Egypt, but by and large, if you had any kind of status, education, wealth, position in society, you were taken captive to Babylon. And so you were exiled from the promised land. So you lost the promised land. You also lost the throne. And so you no longer have a Davidic king. There were times in here where Egypt took over, Babylon took over, but you still had a Davidic king, a vassal king at that, but you still had a kingdom. And you just had to pay tribute to the empire that was over you. Okay, at 587, they lost even that. So there's no longer a throne of David, and it kind of throws into the question, God, what happened about this promise? What happened about the promise of the land? What happened about the promise of having a Davidic king? Okay, third thing that they lost. When the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 587, they also destroyed the temple. And so the temple was destroyed, it was burned, it was just in shambles. And so here they are in exile. And it's this time of really kind of existential crisis, if you will, in terms of, okay, who are we? Did our God let us down? Did our God fail us? Were the Babylonian gods stronger than our God? Because here we are in Babylon. And they took the things from the temple and carried them to the temples of their gods as kind of trophies that our God is victorious. So in Babylon, do they give up on the Lord? And do they start worshiping the gods of the Babylonians? They must be superior. Did their God fail them, or did their God simply abandon them and not keep the promise? Are they going to continue to be the people of the Lord, or are they going to just blend in and become Babylonian and make the most of it? Well, as they're wrestling with their faith and wrestling with their identity, the Lord begins to speak to them, and they begin to realize and maybe finally hear that what do they still have left? They still have the Torah left. They still have the covenant left. And part of the Torah was this section of blessings and curses. And that if you keep covenant, you'll experience God's blessings and things will go well for you in the land. But if you break covenant, if you are disloyal to God and worship other gods or rely upon other things, if you are betraying one another in terms of exploiting each other, not doing right by each other, then you're going to come under curse. And the ultimate curse is you will be removed from the promised land, exile. And there are smaller curses along the way, drought, famine, invasion, but the ultimate curse is to be exiled from the promised land. Sure enough, that's what happened. And they begin to realize, well, wait a minute, God is still keeping covenant. God is still being faithful to what we agreed to back here at Mount Sinai. And so they began to have this hope that maybe if in exile, maybe if in Babylon, if they start keeping covenant there, start practicing Torah there, that God will be just as faithful to bless as he was faithful to curse. And so in the midst of exile, there begins to arise this hope that God is going to restore and keep the other parts of the promise. And so there becomes hope that God will raise up a new son of David, a branch from the shoot of Jesse. And we read about that in Isaiah. We read about that in Ezekiel, where God talks about how he's going to come and shepherd the people himself. Okay, so there is this hope that rises up in the prophets and through the prophets that God is going to raise up a new son of David to reestablish God's rule, David's rule over Israel. There is hope of a new temple. And we especially see this in Ezekiel. Ezekiel was actually taken captive to Babylon. And God gives him a vision of a new temple. And that God's glory will return and settle upon that temple. And God will reside over his people again, be present in Jerusalem. So there arises this hope of a new temple. There arises hope of a regathering of Israel. That as they were scattered all over the place, all over the empire, that they will be regathered and restored to the promised land. And we see this again in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Jeremiah is commissioned by God after the fall to buy a field. And to buy a field, well, the fall's about to happen, and everybody finally believes Jeremiah that it's about to happen. So right before the fall, Jeremiah buys a field as a symbol that there will be a homecoming, that there will be a return. Ezekiel sees them coming back and has a vision of kind of dry bones being brought to life. And God tells them, I'm going to bring them back and I'm going to change them. And they speak in terms of a new covenant even. Whereas in this old covenant, it was Israel's responsibility to inscribe it upon their own hearts, to make it part of their character. God says in this new covenant, I'm going to write it on your hearts. I'm going to inscribe it there and engrave it within your character so that you'll live this way. And I'll give you a new heart and I'll put my spirit within you. And so this becomes actually from despair to this time of incredible hope that God is going to bring about a restoration. Okay, in 539, Cyrus, king of Persia, conquers the Babylonians. And so now we have another change in empires, and the Persians take over. Cyrus is their king, and Cyrus has a different policy. Cyrus has his policy to where people can return, and he'll even help them rebuild their temples, because Cyrus basically believes that if you keep all the gods happy, the more gods you keep happy, the better things are going to be in your empire. And so you're gonna send people home, enable them to rebuild their temples, to worship their gods, and those gods will bless you for it. Okay, and so he sees Israel's God that way. And so 538, return begins to take place. Not everybody goes back to Jerusalem. Some of them have built new lives in Babylon and within the Persian Empire, but the return begins to happen. And about 515, BC, you get the second temple rebuilt and rededicated to God. And I'm going to go ahead and put this on pause, erase the board. I'll be right back to you. Okay, now we got our second part of the timeline up here, and you can see we're starting 539, Cyrus, king of Persia, they conquer the Babylonians. 538 enables the Jews to begin to return home. Then we go to 515, we have the second temple is rebuilt, but it's not nearly as glorious as the first temple, and they still don't have a Davidic king. They're still under the Persians. And there are still Jews scattered all over the place. So it's not like they're back in their own land. It's not like that their land belongs to them. They are under Persian rule. And so to some extent, the promises are being kept, but at the same time, they're very much unfulfilled. And there is the hope that God will somehow raise up a new son of David and really make things right, really make things new, that this restoration will be complete. We see as we read in Ezra and Nehemiah, sometime around 460, 450 in the Persian period, that I guess I should probably get Persia all up here. That in this Persian period, the people's hearts haven't really been transformed either. That Ezra calls them out for repeating many of the sins that brought them into exile in the first place. And so there's still this deep, deep need for God to return, for God to keep the promises in full. So they're moving in that direction, and they're not technically in exile any longer, but it's not like the promises have been kept. And so there is still this hope that God is going to do yet more. Around 333, 331, Alexander the Great takes over, and he takes over the whole world. And so his goal is not simply to amass more land and more power. He wants to Hellenize the world. So every place he goes, he tries to bring in Greek culture to Hellenize the East. And so Alexander has this big project going on, this big kind of cultural project, if you will, but he dies around 323. And so he conquers the world, has this big project, and then he dies. And what happens to his kingdom? His kingdom is divided up amongst his 4 generals, and we're concerned about 2 of them. The first general that we're concerned about, his name is Ptolemy, and he takes over the area of Egypt. And so you have the Ptolemies ruling in Egypt, and they're going to rule for generations. They take over Egypt about 323, and up until 198, the land of Judea, Jerusalem, Palestine, all of that was under their rule. And you may recall I mentioned that during the exile, there were some Jews that escaped down to Egypt. And so there's a strong Jewish community down in Egypt. And so because of this, there is very favorable relationships between the Ptolemies and the Jews and those who are residing in Jerusalem. And so the worship of the Lord continues in the temple. Everything is pretty good. In fact, it's during this time period that the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek, and the abbreviation for that is LXX, the Septuagint. And so why did they do that? Well, because Alexander's project was so successful that the Jews living down in Egypt no longer spoke Aramaic, no longer spoke Hebrew, that their first language was Greek. And so there was this need to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek so that the Jews could read their own Bible. So again, favorable relationships with the Jews in Jerusalem, worship of the Lord going on in the temple, and then the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, the Septuagint, for all the Greek-speaking Jews at that time. Now, what happens after that? Well, the other general that we're concerned about, his name was Seleucus. And the Seleucus family, they took over Syria, which is to the north of Palestine. And in 198, the Seleucid kingdom became so strong that they took over Palestine and took it away, took Jerusalem away from the Ptolemies. And so now Palestine, Jerusalem, Judea, that whole territory, it's under the Seleucid kingdom, and they weren't so friendly to the Jews. They were trying to force the Jews to worship Zeus and to really impose Hellenistic culture upon all Jews. And so one king in particular, Antiochus Epiphanes, okay, he was a major persecutor of the Jews. And he insisted that they worship Zeus. He insisted that they embrace Greek culture. And he takes over Jerusalem, and around 167 thereabouts, he sets up a statue of Zeus in the temple, and he has a pig sacrificed to Zeus on the Jerusalem altar, defiling it. And he's forcing Jews everywhere to worship the Hellenistic gods. And he basically makes it a capital crime to worship the Lord. And he's going village by village, and he sends a representative to a village called Modi, not far from Jerusalem, and insists that the people worship Zeus there and sacrifice to the Greek gods, and they refuse to do so. Well, at least one guy refused to do so. His name was Mattathias. And when somebody else in the village gave in, Mattathias was so outraged at the compromise that he began a revolt. And he killed that representative from Antiochus Epiphanes, and he killed his fellow villager as well. And they started this kind of guerrilla warfare, terrorist warfare, if you will, to take back Jerusalem. And this goes on for a couple of years. And finally, in 165, they are successful. And this is referred to as the Maccabean Revolt. And they take back Jerusalem from the Seleucid kingdom. And they cleanse and rededicate the temple to the Lord. This is celebrated by Hanukkah. Hanukkah is a celebration of this victory and this rededication of the Lord. Now, it's called the Maccabean Revolt because one of Mattathias' sons who participated in the revolt, he got the nickname of Maccabeus. That means the hammer. And he was so successful in this warfare that they named the whole thing after him, the Maccabean Revolt. Now, in this revolt, not only did you have the warriors, but you had a group that was sometimes referred to as the Hasidim. The Hasidim, they were the ones who were supporting the warriors. They were the ones who stayed loyal to the Lord, to practicing the ways of the covenant, to keeping Sabbath, all of that. And so they were supportive. And we think that out of this group, we get the Pharisees. And the Pharisees become very focused on kind of being loyal to the Torah, loyal to the Lord. And we think it started back here with the Maccabean Revolt. And so I know that we tend to look at the Pharisees as kind of very legalistic. Jesus is kind of in battle with them oftentimes throughout the Gospels because of being so legalistic. But at their beginnings, they were the ones who were being faithful in the midst of this pressure to compromise and to worship, the Greek gods. And so over time, they became legalistic, but realized at their beginnings, they were the faithful ones who were refusing to compromise their faith. Okay, let's see, what else do we need to know about that? When the Maccabees took over, power corrupts. And so they laid claim to the Davidic throne, even though they weren't of the line of David. They tried to rule Jerusalem as kings, and indeed they did. And they also tried to lay claim to the temple as high priest. And they were a priestly family, but they were not entitled to the high priesthood. And so you had a group that thought they should have been the priests, that they were entitled to be the priests. They left, and they went out to Qumran, out to the Dead Sea, and they formed what's referred to as the Qumran community, practiced a lot of priestly rituals out there and a lot of study of the scriptures. And then you have the Qumran community, then you have the Pharisees. The Sadducees were the ones who were kind of running the temple and in power there. The Pharisees were focused on keeping Torah. And then at Qumran, you had a group known as the Essenes. And what they are doing is they are kind of being very focused on priestly rituals out there at the Dead Sea. Now, they take it back, and so they have a kingdom kind of within the kingdom, but it's not the Davidic kingdom, and eventually Rome is coming on the scene. And in 63, Rome is going to take over the whole territory. And so that's the end of the Seleucid kingdom, basically, end of the Ptolemies. Rome is the power, about 63 BC. And Rome governs in two main ways. Rome will use vassal kings like King Herod or Herod the Great, and they will allow Herod to stay in power, to have kind of control of his little kingdom, as long as Herod maintains order, and as long as Herod keeps sending in the tribute, the tax money to the Romans, Herod can stay as king. Okay, so that's one of the ways that Rome would exercise control, is through vassal kings. Okay, and then governors would be the other way. And so if vassal kings proved to be unfaithful, not very reliable, then Rome would establish that territory as their own, and they would use a governor to rule it. And most famous governor in the New Testament is Pilate, and he is governor over Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' death. And so Rome takes over. Rome is very determined to maintain order. I think it's not for a few more years after 63 that they actually take over Egypt, but you got the picture that Rome is over this territory. So you can see that the Jews and Jerusalem, quite a history of being invaded, quite a history of being taken over. First by the Babylonians, and then by the Persians, and then by the Greeks, and then by the Ptolemies down in Egypt, and then by the Seleucid kingdom, and then by the Romans. And, you know, what's with God's promise of a Davidic throne? What's with God's promise of God really watching over the temple and being present there and filling that place with his glory? What's with the promise of the land, to where it will actually be their land and they'll be regathered to it, rather than being a people that is scattered all over the place? Okay, and the promise of Torah, to where they'll be able to actually keep Torah and be able to be a people that truly is holy and priestly and reflects the character of God out into the world. What's with those promises? Will they be kept? And there was this intense hope that God was going to keep the promises, and that God was going to raise up a new son of David. And the responsibility of that son of David would be to regather Israel and to establish God's rule over Israel, and really God's rule over all peoples. And that God would be present, that this new son of David would restore the temple and make it truly new, so that it was evident that God was present there. And so this regathering and this time of blessing. It's into this world that John the Baptist comes preaching to repent, that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that God is about to break in with God's rule and establish the rule of his son, the rule of the son of David, that God is going to establish that. And so John the Baptist is calling people to repent and to get ready for it, to change their ways, to start living right, to start keeping Torah, because God's going to send this king who is going to bring in God's rule. And then Jesus comes, and Jesus starts announcing that God's kingdom is at hand, that God's rule is breaking into the present. And so when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, it's in this context of kingdom after kingdom after kingdom. And no, it's no longer kingdom after kingdom after kingdom. It's God's kingdom that is come in and through Jesus. And that Jesus is that son of David that God has raised up to usher in this new day. By the way, I know we haven't been in class much, but how many disciples did Jesus officially call? You guessed it, 12. Okay, he had more followers than that. Why 12? 12 is he is symbolically regathering the people of Israel, regathering the children of Abraham. And so that's why 12, the symbolism of regathering, which is what the king was supposed to do. When Jesus rides into Jerusalem on the donkey, it's kind of a royal entry, if you will, symbolizing that he is the king that is coming. And you know the first place he goes? He goes to the temple. Okay, why? Because it was the son of David's job to make sure that things were right at the temple, to rebuild, renew the temple. So he goes there. And so Jesus is symbolically fulfilling this role, even though he doesn't fit the exact expectations of what they thought. He is symbolically fulfilling this role of being this son of David, who is ushering in God's kingdom in the midst of all these empires that have kind of controlled Jerusalem generation after generation. And Jesus is going to reestablish or the rule of God, or it will break in anew through Jesus. And we'll see how the story goes. But I want you to have a sense of kind of the world that Jesus is born into. And so when Jesus begins his ministry announcing that the kingdom of God is at hand, to realize how this has been hoped for generations upon generations upon generations. Okay, we'll stop this one here and be back in just a bit.